Hi everyone, this is Tim Von Rieden with cgcookie.com, and I will be doing a live stream day in just a moment. And I have Deandra here with me, and she will be answering the questions. Because as always, if you have any questions, even if they're not related to the live stream at hand, feel free to ask them, and we will make sure to get back to you as soon as we see them. And let me just do the finishing the marketing push on all of our social websites, and then we will be good to go. All right. Welcome everyone to this Concept Cookie Wednesday live stream. We do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m. That's Central Time, and that's -5 GMT if you're outside of the States. And in today's live stream, we're going to do something a little different where I'm just going to take you through just drawing the basics of foliage. And there's two ways I do it. It's either from scratch or from a photo reference, and I'm going to take you through both. So it might not be a long, full hour live stream, but I feel like it should give enough information to hopefully help you guys draw it on your own. So with that, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. So this is something that I've been working on recently, and I've had to do a lot of foliage for it, and this is something that I've come to try to learn some techniques and tricks to make it faster and more efficient. And if I zoom in here, so when I zoom in, you can see this, but a lot of it is a little blurry or even sketchy, and that's just because of how many photos and overlays and filters I'm using to create a base for me to draw on top of. So this is a good example of one that started out more as like a collection of photos, and I use them as a base. And then my other reference photo, which let me find it really quick. And this is the other way of doing it, and this is where one I took from scratch, and I never really considered myself to be an environment artist. I always considered myself to be more of a character artist. And that's why this one I did all from scratch, and I think that's why it probably took a little longer and it's not as lifelike, I want to say. It's more fantastical. But it gave me a good sense into realizing different steps that you can go about taking to create foliage like this. And a lot of times you're just trying to create visual noise to kind of bring your attention to where the focus should be, where in this case it is her face and the head area, and then your eye will kind of draw down into this S movement that we got here from her body language. And then it kind of gets drawn back up to the face. So you got to be constantly thinking about why you're adding foliage, and is it helping or is it adding too much noise where it can almost become too much. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in this canvas here. And I'm just going to start from a clean blank slate. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of fill this out right here. Take away that bottom bar. Now, I want to make sure I can see the questions as well, just in case. There we go. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to bring in some colors. So when working with foliage, I think that first instant reaction would be to grab green. But if we're trying to do something that's more lifelike and more based in earth tones, we want to grab something that's actually more on the yellow side of things. So I know you guys can't see my screen fully, but I'm just pulling up the color picker and I'm sliding the hue bar more toward yellow. So it's creating more of a warm green. But even at that same saturation, it's still way too vivid for what I'm looking for. So now we got to go down on the value scale and on the saturation. So now the new color we create is something more like this. And you can see the difference that these two colors make, where they're both still green, but there's definitely a huge difference between this vivid, attention-needy green and this one that's more subtle. And then from here, I would probably grab different variations of this green, so something with maybe more gray, maybe something with some more yellow tones in it. And I would create sometimes, not always, but sometimes I would create kind of a collage color picker. And usually I have a swatch kit on the side that I would normally draw my colors from. But in this case, I'm pulling my colors by first creating new ones. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab a few more, and then we're going to go forward and start using them to create some foliage. And like I said, we do have the Q&A on the side that we're constantly looking at. I do have Deandra here, so we will be able to answer your questions more efficiently now. And I'm also going to be pulling in some of my brown colors. And this is to help kind of break the monotony of it being too much green, where sometimes it works if you add different shades of a color, where this green, more muted ones and more warms, might actually turn into more of a brown color, and that's more than okay. So let's say we were working with these colors first. First thing I'm going to do is I would probably bring up reference. If I was being completely honest with myself, I would probably pull up reference first before I started doing this. But let's just say we're doing a simple stem, and then we're going to kind of grow leaves off of this. So I'd probably lay down a simple base for the stem. And then this is where, and I'm using the circle hardage brush, so nothing fancy. And if you're doing a lot of foliage, I would probably even recommend finding a good foliage brush or a brush or a leaf brush or something that would give you more texture, something that would give you a faster result. We're doing it all from a circle hardage brush. It actually is very time consuming. And if you're either working for a client or you're doing something where you're doing an environment with like a forest or something, you need to get that foliage out a lot quicker than using a circle hardage brush. So this is just one way of doing it. This is more of like a study, I would say, more so than an actual efficient process. So I usually like to start off by having one leaf that is pretty generic and just kind of showcases the form and the shape of the leaf, because then from there you can kind of have fun with it and bend it, and people will know what that leaf will look like if you saw it from a different angle, because you have one that's giving you a pretty solid direction of what it looks like. You know what? I'll make this larger. I feel like it's probably too small for you guys. I'm not worrying about keeping it perfect at this point, because even here, like, these edges are very sloppy. But I'm not caring so much about that as so much as the look of it, and we're almost looking to create sort of like a silhouette. And then I'm working with that then to finish off the rest of the plant. Oh, you guys can't see I'm still focused on the wrong one. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so if you guys weren't able to tell what I was just doing, pretty much I was using the circle hardage brush. And actually, you know what? I'll just redo it. That didn't take much time at all. Could you open this window? I'm about to sweat in here. Okay. So pretty much I'm using the circle hardage brush, and the first thing that I did is I'm creating a stem. So literally nothing too complicated. And yeah, I'm sorry guys that I was sharing out the wrong screen. I didn't even realize it until Deandra pointed it out to me. Because yeah, then you didn't see anything besides just hearing me talk about what I was doing. So yeah, so pretty much if here is our basic stem, and I tried to create something that's not like a perfect straight line. I think adding a little variation to it would actually add more interest without going overboard. So then what I was saying is I would make my brush size smaller, because I usually try to create the leaf stem to be smaller than the main stem point here. So then from here, I try to create one leaf that kind of showcases the leaf shape and the size, because then with one kind of in place and it's very apparent, like how big it is and the shaping of the leaf, then I will do like offshoots of that same leaf, but then I'll angle it. But since you have one that's giving the audience a clear direction of the leaf size, you don't have to worry about it looking like weird or confusing the viewer on what the actual leaf is. Because if I did this one first, let's erase that one. This might be kind of confusing, where it almost looks like it could be like a bean plant. But when you add in this leaf, it's like instantly recognizable. Oh, that's another leaf. It just bent and it's at a different angle. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. And when I'm thinking about this, I'm just thinking about doing something that isn't this and isn't this. So as I keep doing my leaves, I try to create something slightly different from each other. And obviously you're just not going to be able to do that all the time. You're going to have to repeat some shapes and forms. But for the most part, I try to keep it as different as I can until I start to get to that phase where it's like, okay, now I kind of have to repeat different or the same things that I've been doing. And sometimes if I feel like I want to give a size variation, like the budding life cycle of a plant, I might have some new leaves that are smaller just to kind of show that this is still like a budding plant. and it's still growing. So something as simple as that. And then if I bring in, I'll just bring in my references and make them a lot smaller and put them in the corner. Because what I'm doing is more of like a singular stem. But for something that's more of like a collection of foliage, this is where I like to have more fun with it. So let's say at the bottom of this one, let's have some more, like a group or collection of foliage that kind of built up. So I'll usually build it up with the shapes. I probably work with a larger brush. And for the most part, I'm not looking to create something that is very structural in terms of like having it look perfect or symmetrical. I'm actually just having more fun with it, and that's why you can kind of get away with things like this when they're more organic. So I think that maybe that's why I tend to do more organic stuff, is because you can get away with doing things that aren't perfect. They don't have to be like flat angled. You don't have to worry about lighting hitting it perfectly. You can just kind of have fun with it. Or at least I do. Maybe you guys you like playing more structural based, and it's kind of the opposite of what I like to do. So primarily I've been only using this color. But if I only push on the tablet like at half pressure or even lighter than that, so even like at this pressure, you can still see how we're getting a variety of a gradient of the same color. And that's why down here we're starting to get different color variants, but it's the same color usage. So sometimes I'll even go back and like outline it, and this is where we go more toward like a style-based version of drawing these plans. And that's where I would pull in another color. And then where that color begins, if I was doing something more fantastical, like on this tree or this elemental tree sprite lady, I'd probably start in this lighter kind of yellow color and build it around these darker edges, because that contrast in that hue will really pop out. And you can kind of see as I lay it right against here, it definitely separates the two from each other.
What kind of tablet do you use, Tim?
Normally I work on a Intuos 4 tablet, but right now I'm actually using my Cintiq as a tablet, but I have the Cintiq screen turned off. So this is one of those things where I've gotten used to, like if I do line art or something, I'll turn the screen on. But I find that for the most part, I still work more efficiently when I'm using more of like a tablet-based system for my coloring. So let's grab some of those colors that we created initially as well. Because a lot of it is working intuitively. So here I'm not really having any method that I'm trying to follow or I'm trying to stick to. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, what color would work well against this particular color? And then I choose it from my color selection up here, and then I apply it down here. So this is where art becomes more relaxing for me, where it's not so much structural or methodical, but it's more just what I feel would be right and testing it out and kind of making it work. But this would also be very fantastical coloring. If I was going for more realistic, I would probably shy away from using colors that are stray too far away from that solid green base. And even this green that I'm using is pretty saturated for what a real green might be in nature, where a real green would probably cater toward more like a darker, that's more of like a pine tree, I guess. It would be something with a bit more value into it, so the lightness wouldn't be quite as strong. But even from here, let's say we wanted to add those darker colors, I could always create a new layer and mask out what we already have. And we could even do this with the multiply layer. You can see how you can instantly give it that darker color. Now this is probably a little too intense, where I'll probably soften it up in areas and maybe around the edges. And this is a process I probably rinse and repeat for a while, where then I'll make a new layer on top of this, which would be a normal layer. And then I would kind of work on top of that multiply layer we just created and blend it in more so it's not so apparent that, there's that multiply layer that just darkened a certain area. And that's where we can create those colors that aren't so light and probably more toward the realism spectrum of colors. I guess while I'm doing some simple shading and coloring, I just want to remind you guys that tomorrow is the first artist that we have from our Summer Extravaganza tutorial that's going to be released. It's from Psychra, and if you know him, he is a YouTube tutorial author that's pretty well known, and he does some great stuff, and I just rewatched this tutorial this morning, and it really is a fantastic tutorial, and it just is a great one about talking about creating your own style, but still understanding that when you create your own style, you have to put limitations on yourself and how to work with those limitations rather than let them hinder you. So I think it's a great tutorial that will kind of shed some light on that subject matter if that's something you're interested in. So here I grabbed this lighter green, and this is to add some, not so much highlights as it's to add more detail on the actual leaves themselves. So like even on the stem, you can see on the middle, I worked up some of this lighter green, but I'm staying away from pulling it all the way to the edge. And depending on what kind of a leaf it is, some leaves have this really cool pattern to them that you can try to replicate. And some of them have a lighter tone to them on the sides of the leaf, and then they get darker more toward the middle. Actually, I really don't like how I did that. And if you hate what you just created, you can do what I just did and just quickly erase it. And now for the actual flower part, I'm not going to do anything fancy. We're just going to leave it pretty blank, because I want to focus more on like creating the leaves and the sections around the actual foliage. So like on the bottom here, and keep in mind I'm really trying to hit more of a fantastical element with these leaves. I'm not trying to go for hyper-realism or anything. And I'll take you through something more on that spectrum after I finish this. So if this is kind of like the highlight here, I'm going to do the same thing that I did over on this elemental creature I did, where the ones that are less in the foreground, so one that aren't quite in the background but they're still attached to her, I'm going to make lighter in value. So I could even put this behind all of these layers, like this. And this is a technique that artists use when they're trying to showcase or even add contrast to the main focus. Where since these are less bold, they're less intense, your eye won't be drawn to this part of the base here as so much as it will be directed right to the center. And that's just purely based on the contrast that we're adding here. I could even make another new layer under that. And this is borderline on like cartoon fantasy, where depending on what style I'm going for, I mean, this might be perfect for a project I'm working on, or it might actually be too cartoony and I would probably have to rework it just a tad. Where with hers, I just got away with it passing for being more, I don't want to say sophisticated, but a little less cartoony. Where having a lot of these soft bumps and edges definitely adds that characteristic of cartoon. Alright, so then I guess this would be kind of something I would rinse and repeat and do as often as needed to create something finished. And you know what, maybe I'll spend just a little more time on it to make it a tad more nicer. And let's integrate some of these yellows. So yellow for me for the longest time was a color I try to avoid like a plague almost, just because I hate how intense it is and it's very attention needy. But lately I've been using it subtly more, and I've found to kind of grow a fondness for yellow. Where if used correctly, I think it really does direct the eye, and it can lighten up your image, and it definitely adds more warmth to almost anything you add just because of how intense the hue is. So I try to add it in subtly and not overdo the effect.
Somebody asked, how would you go about doing, like, covering a large surface with plants?
So if I was to do a large surface that I needed covered entirely with foliage or plants, I would probably use a brush. Or I would do the next technique that I'm about to show you guys, where if, for me, I went out and I actually took photos of different trees and bushes and plants around this pond that I live nearby, and I placed them in the canvas themselves, and I like rework them, I flip them, I just make a big mess collage of it, and then I paint over it to make it look all hand painted. And I think for doing such a large quantity of plants, you almost have to take different shortcuts where if you did it all by hand, it would be very time consuming. And if this is for a project or for work, your time is of the essence, and you want to be as efficient as possible with using your time. So I definitely would either use photos and mix them up, or just find a brush that really pertains to the whatever you're trying to create. All right, let me reformulate that statement into a question. Are you going to be talking about covering a large surface with plants? Yes, I'll show you guys how I can cover a large surface with plants after this. So the live stream is split up into two sections. So this first one is how to do more like fantastical plants with colors, and more or less showing you guys how just contrast of different colors butting up against each other adds that look of foliage. And if you repeat it multiple times over and over, you can get that nice organic feel to whatever you're working on. But this definitely has more of a slightly more cartoony and almost animated sense, depending on how you work with the different colors, or on how circular and unrigid you make the bumps. So I guess now I'll show you how to do a large grouping. So let me grab my reference image back here. Alright, so this is something probably more what you guys are looking for, where if it's covering, in this case it's covering a pole. Let me see if I have any other section of this I would probably want to share. Yeah, I would say this is probably the best one. So pretty much, I'm going to open up my iPhoto, and these are just photos, and I really do recommend using photos that you take on your own. I mean, you're definitely free to use references on the internet, and you want to make sure that they're free to use, or else you may get into trouble. But the way I always looked at it is it's more personal if you take the photos yourself, and there's more of a connection to it. So I'm just going to bring in these two. And the best time to take photos, if you're doing references, is when it's overcast. And that means when the cloud is covering the sun, and you're still getting a lot of light and bounce lighting from the sun, but you aren't getting those direct shadows that can actually hurt the photo quality. Okay. So in this case, I'm going to have to, let me hide these first. I'm going to have to make like a little section for it. Oops. Alright, so I'm going to do all this on the left side here, where everything we did earlier is on the right side. Okay, so I'm going to bring those photos on the left side here. Now there's a few ways I can go about doing this. So what really depends on is the background color. So since I'm working on more of a neutral pale background, there's a few things I could do. I could either change these into different layer modes, so I can see like what would a soft light look like, what would an overlay, and then what would a multiply layer look like. Oops, not color burn. I mean, you can do color burn, but I try to avoid color burn because sometimes it does exactly what it says and burns your image, or it looks like it's been burnt. So in this case, since I'm not working on a very solid background, I would probably make the background a tad more interesting. So let's bring in more of a texture brush. And now I'm going to copy that original photo I did that has it set on multiply, and now let's change that one to an overlay. You can see how we're starting to get kind of a chaotic mess. And this is exactly what I'm going for. And I know it sounds crazy, but I like to do this technique not too often because it drives me crazy. My OCD can't handle all the chaos. but it's a great way to create a lot of visual noise fast, and then you can paint on top of it. Because then when you paint on top, that's when you actually will create the very nice finish that you're looking for. But sometimes it's hard when you're working just on a blank canvas. That's why something like this would take me longer. It's because I'm not working against anything. I'm really just working against myself if I'm trying to save time. So this would be an example of visual noise. Now what I would probably do is even soften some of the edges, where like the multiply layer definitely needs some softening up, because those blunt, sharp edges are definitely not organic in any sense, and they actually can distract the viewer. But you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So I'm creating these forms and shapes kind of randomly and sporadically, but then I'll pull from them. So I'm going to actually put all of these photos in a group so you can see what it looks like before and after. So we still have that original brush laydown, so you can see what it looks like without the brush. So you can see how the brush kind of directs where the forms are going to be. So I'm going to make a new layer above that. And I probably wouldn't even use the circle brush for this. I would probably use a texture brush. And in this case, I could even use my chalk brush. And a lot of the times, I'll keep the tree itself, so the trunk and the base, more in a shadow, and I'll kind of bring the colors out as I go. But I do like to build some underlying structure to it where the viewer can start to see, oh, okay, that's where the tree is, and that's where all these branches are directing off of. So either I'll kind of make a silhouette of the tree, and to do that I'll just kind of edge it out, and then I'll work from there. So I think a lot of this bottom stuff I'm going to actually cut out. So we can imagine as if the tree was starting there, and maybe this is a bush. And like we can pretend that this is a creek coming around the corner here. So even for a creek, I would probably grab a photo that I've taken and mash that up together, because otherwise I'm drawing it from scratch, and that can take a lot of time. Alright, so back to creating that base. So this tree itself, and actually I'm going to create a base on each side, because with so much visual noise, it really drives me crazy. So I try to work one piece at a time. So let's just edge this off so I can kind of at least contain what we're working on here. So imagine that this was like our canvas edge. And a lot of the time, photo reference colors can be not so much flat, but they can be very monotonous, where like this is very much a green palette with different shades of the value of it. And I like to have some fun and creativity, or not creativity, some liberty of adding different colors and still having it feel realistic, but also having that painterly undertone that I kind of like, and I try to aim for at least. So in here, I'm still edging out that silhouette. And then on this right side, I would probably get another photo and lay it over there. But for the most part, I try to work with the photo and like work around the different colors that stand out to me. And it does help having an actual trunk in the photo you take, or a tree, because then you can work with that rather than trying to create your own entirely from scratch. So the photo I had that slight photo of a trunk. And I'll keep the photo on the side so you can kind of see what I'm working from and how different the actual photo looks from the finished product. Because a lot of the time I think people think that adding photos is just like an easy way to cheat yourself into something quicker. And in a way, it is something that will help you quicker, but I don't see it so much as cheating so much as it is making you more efficient as an artist. And I think that's something that the art community has a bad reputation with, instantly like writing something off if it has a photo use in it. But I do have that as well, only if the photo isn't integrated well. Where if I literally just pulled this image, plopped it in this photo, and didn't really do much manipulation to it, or I didn't make it into my own, then I can kind of see where then it's more of a matte painting with photography. It's not so much a digital painting. So with this, I'm going to try to make it as much my own as I possibly can. And oftentimes I like to add random shaping to it. So like even, let me grab a color so you can see it. Even here, sometimes just those visual blocks helps to kind of draw your eye in different areas, because right now it's so chaotic. It actually, your eye doesn't know where to focus on. So you always got to be thinking about how a viewer is going to look at a piece you've done and where their eye is going to be drawn to. And that's not something you so much learn as it's just look at it yourself, try to be unbiased, and where does your eye take you? And that's kind of the simple steps you can follow. So I'm going to add just a tad more color to the tree so it's less black. And if you ever heard many artists talk about trying to avoid using pure blacks or pure whites in their pieces, and I definitely agree with them. So I want to make this tree a little less black silhouette, give some more life to it. And if this is our tree in the foreground, the ones in the background, I'd probably make a little lighter in value. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here, where it gives some more space and some more visual perspective to it. So just by grabbing one of the lighter green colors, I'm just lightly shading over some of the plants that where I'm making more farther away in the image. And if I turn that layer on and off, you can kind of see how that breaks up this branch from the background, or what's now become more of the background.
Somebody suggested that you add some very dark branches or leaves in the front and blur them with Gaussian blur.
Oh yeah, if you want some depth of field, here we go. Let me grab, actually I'm going to grab some of these leaves from the photo. And a lot of times you'll see people even use the selection tool and they'll individually select. I probably should do more of that. Just for some reason I have more fun just using the eraser tool and bring those leaves in that way. So like let's say this was in our foreground, but our focus was around this area. And if we really wanted to play with depth of field, things that are more directly in the foreground or things in the background, so things over here, would be less in focus. And we're thinking of it more as like a camera or how our eye works even, and how things that we focus on become crisp and clear, and then the things that are not in focus become more blurry. So in this sense, let's take one of our filters. And Gaussian blur is probably the most used one and the most, I would say, gives the best result. So let's say we do it about there. Actually, before I do that, I want to clean up the selection a little bit more. And you know what? I'm going to be efficient this time, and I'm going to actually use my selection tool. So I'm pretty much selecting all the visual garbage that aren't the leaves, and it's just kind of containing leaves right now. And I'm selecting it, deleting it. There we go. So that's, you can see the difference between before and after. It's a really quick way to take away noise. Now what I'm also going to do before I blur it is I'm going to change the adjustments. So I'm going to go to my levels. I'm going to make it darker because right now it stands out so much that it actually is grabbing too much attention. So I'm going to make it darker on my levels, and I'm going to choose my brightness and contrast. I'm going to turn that contrast down. And the brightness maybe a little bit down. Something more like there. So if I go before and after, you can see the difference that will make. Now let's go to our filters and let's choose our Gaussian blur. So I'm going to choose, and if you do a crazy amount of the radius for the pixels, it'll even be gone. It'll actually blur it so much to the point that you can't even see it anymore. About halfway through, so about let's say a 50, it's more of just a blur nothing. And even at like 10, it's still pretty strong. So I'd recommend staying in between like a 2 and a 5. So usually 4 works well for me. And that looks alright. And you can just adjust the slider bar back and forth, and it should give you an automated response on your canvas on what it should look like. So something like that. And maybe even if I made this slightly bigger, and then take away the parts that aren't in the canvas. Actually, I kind of like that one hanging leaf. Let's make it less awkward. Something like that. And I think what they would also suggest me do, so if I had all these layers together, is I can either use a blur, smudge, or even my liquify filter, and I could just blur this background area. And you probably won't see the effect right away because sometimes it takes a few swipes on your actual tablet for it to actually start to come into play. But if I do my undos, you can see the subtle difference. Let me zoom in for you guys. So you can kind of see how that visually your eye is less directed, or there's less need to go in the blurry areas because there's more areas in focus that your eyes will want to retain the focus on. All right, so now that all my layers, so I combined all my layers to do that blur effect, and depending on how comfortable you are, I try to work on a minimum amount of layers and treat it more like a painting. I feel like that makes it more where I'm able to take more risks, because then I'll create a new layer and then I'll take that risk, and if it doesn't work, I'll just delete that layer, but if it does work, then I'll just merge it down to the painting. And that way it just feels more final, where I'm not worrying about things as much either. All right, so now from here, let's say the focus I want to be on the center part of this tree. Let's take this visual noise that we added with photos and make it into something more painterly. So I'm going to zoom in for this. So oftentimes, I'll either, like I said before, I usually have a pre-selected amount of colors in a palette next to me on a swatch kit. But oftentimes, I'll just pull from the photo itself and then adjust the colors later on. So I always try to have that one leaf that gives you a good perspective of the size and shape.
Somebody asked, you don't think it's cheating to use photos at all?
Oof, this is one of those that it can, like, it's tough. I think this is a question that a lot of artists have to ask themselves, and I think it's more of how their intention is to use it, and if they're using it to cover up mistakes, or if they're using it to do something that they cannot on their own because they're not skilled enough at a certain thing. Like if you bring in photos of hands to draw on top of your characters because you're not that good at hands, I feel like that's cheating. Because then, if anything, you're not cheating the image, you're cheating yourself. Because then you'll never actually learn how to draw hands correctly if you're always taking shortcuts or easy way out. But I think there's a point where if you know already how to draw something, and if you're working for a company or you're trying to save time, there is a time and place for using photos and manipulating them to create an image. And that's not to say that like I don't know how to draw leaves exactly, even though I would say environments aren't my go-to. I wouldn't say I'm comfortable with them completely, but I will say I know how to draw a leaf, and if I was wanting to do this all by hand, each individual leaf, it would take a very long time. More time than I'm willing to give for an image if it was for a client, especially if they needed it by like the end of the day. There's no way I would get it done all by hand. So you can't think of it so much as cheating as you have to start thinking about, okay, do I know how to do this? Is it worth adding photos? Can I do this on my own in the amount of time given? And really be the judge yourself. I don't think you should go to other people to ask if it's cheating. Really think about it yourself and be like, am I cheating myself or am I trying to save myself time? But I would always recommend if you're starting out, do not use photos so much. I mean, you can use them as a reference, but keep them away from your canvas or pulling them into your canvas, and work more from learning and looking at a photo and really analyzing it.
I think myself that using like photo references or like just photos in your painting directly in there, That's more for like professionals that already know what they're doing and they just need to save time. But like if you actually like want to learn how to paint something, you shouldn't resort to a photo. Because like Tim said, that's just cheating yourself. And when you don't have access to photos, then does that mean all your skill is gone? Like you're not trying to trick people into thinking that you can do something that you can't. It's just about saving time and being efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes when you use a photo, you'll surprise yourself with like this little gap that has kind of created itself in the tree. Like, would I have created that on my own? Probably not. And sometimes these are what are called in the community happy mistakes, where sometimes you'll play with an image long enough or a illustration and things will just kind of appear as they go. So I use the photos as a pretty good guideline, but I'm building up the structure myself. So I guess that's a good way to look at photos. It's just more of a guideline, and then you have to build up a foundation for
Making it your own.
Yeah.
Adding your own things. Somebody asked, what is the next live stream going to be about?
The next live stream? I'm hoping to bring in one of the artists we have for our summer extravaganza. So we'll see, and I'll let you guys know before next week if that's going to happen or not. But usually the live streams themselves, I think of that morning of what I want to teach or something that I've been working on in my own time personally that I feel like, yeah, I could show you guys how I do this, and if it's something clicks, that's awesome. But for the most part, I really don't go in with a set structure of what I'm going to teach. And usually I like to keep these more casual. And, you know, like even this tree thing, I didn't know I was going to be drawing a full tree. And it's something that just kind of came about. But I'm actually really liking how this is looking. And I hope you guys are able to pick up some tips and tricks from watching and discussing. Because the whole point of these are for you guys to be asking questions and for me to be answering them. So it's not so much on the quality or like creating a finished product by the end of an hour live stream. So much it is as hoping that some of the tips and tricks actually stick and resonate with you guys as you go on and do your own pieces. And this is a trick that I like to do, and I'm calling this a trick because I really do think it is a trick, is when you use a lighter color against a darker one, and that adds that visual contrast. And sometimes I'm not even doing it from a realistic stance, I'm purely doing it from I want the eye to be directed more to this area. It's like all this lighter green that I'm adding in these areas are just to draw your attention inward. So that's definitely one trick you can use, and that doesn't even have to be with environments, almost anything you do. Because anytime you kind of edge out a silhouette, you're definitely going to draw attention to that just from that visual contrast. And for me, I don't want to say hate. I dislike when I can tell that a photo was used and it was like just blurred. So like if I left this part of the image untouched, that I would consider poor use of a photo. Because then that really does border on the side of cheating. Where if you just edit it a little bit and you really make it more painterly in a sense or whatever you're trying to create with it, then I don't see so much of a problem with it. But or even like this, if I left this untouched, yeah, that would bother me. But if I keep making it like this, where it's obviously like the leaves are thicker than leaves actually are, and I'm trying to put some more personal effort into different areas, that's the difference.
I think it's even better to use photos this way because you're strictly using it for inspiration and like not trying to use it to as like a shortcut for like less painting or anything. It's just to like help along the process.
Absolutely.
Somebody asked what your layer settings were for drawing the tree, like over the photo.
You know what? Let me check as I go backwards in time here. Okay, so the tree was this layer, normal. So pretty much I just grabbed this darker color that was, oops, from right here, and I just kind of filled it in on top of the actual canvas. And I don't actually think I used a different layer mode since since I started actually drawing up the tree, I haven't used any overlay or multiply layers at all. It's all just pure color grabbing and then laying it down. Because this is the fun part for me, when you're kind of just looking at different areas and like, how can I make this area more interesting? And then you add your colors, or you add, different brush strokes to do so. Actually, I'm really liking how this tree is starting to turn out.
Mm-hmm.
This weird, awkward tree. And some of that visual noise I'll keep, but I'll still do a few brush strokes over, just so it really doesn't read as a photo that's been manipulated and added. But this is where like a good texture brush would come in handy. So like right now I'm using a chalk brush, and it gives it just a slight sense of texture. But I could even probably push it a bit more and have something that's more foliage based. But for now, I'll just stick with the chalk brush, since this is one of the basic brushes that you can even download in our brushes pack. And eventually I will add some solid foliage brushes. But for all my brushes that I add in Concept Cookie, I like testing them first, and sometimes that just takes a long time. So if I do create some foliage brushes, I would have to run it through some test runs before I feel confident in giving it to you guys. Alright, so I mean from this point forward, I'm pretty much just repeating the same process over and over again. Where I'm looking at, like, so let's say this area right here. I'm taking this leaf right here. I'm kind of doing a solid coloring job on it on top. And then I'll add in like the personal touches on top of that. And then for the most part, I'm going to call that leaf done and move on to the next. So I try to individualize leaves a little bit, but not to the point where I'm driving myself crazy. But I think without using a leaf brush or a foliage brush, you really have to take your time and kind of give each leaf some personality to it and individualize it just a tad. You don't have to go crazy and like add, a different bug on each leaf and really make each leaf stand out, because you still want to make it a grouping of leaves. You don't want each leaf to be demanding your eye's attention.
What do you think of cell shading?
I go back and forth. I don't think I would ever do something personally in that style, but I definitely can appreciate it for what it's worth. I just find a lot of fun in the actual shading process, and cell shading almost takes a lot of that blending option away, where it's very much a two-tone, or sometimes a three-tone, where it's just base color and then light color or highlight color and then shadow color. So I can appreciate it, but I definitely don't think I would use it. But if you're doing it for like to create foliage, that can be a little easier, because then you can use your brush as the base color and then just add in like a heavy layer for shadows or your lights. Let me zoom out. Sometimes I stay so zoomed in that I lose the whole picture, or the feel of the whole picture. So I'm really liking where this is going. I could probably work on this for quite a while. I'll do a little more detailing and then I'll cut the stream, since we're hitting that hour point. But I definitely wanted to show you guys how to create foliage while using a photo, but still feel confident in showing it to people and not feeling like, oh, I cheated or I'm tricking people. Or I'm hoping that's what you get out of this. So here I'm adding visual blocks, and they kind of act as noise, where they don't serve so much as a purpose as just to kind of fill in some of the empty space. And this doesn't even get anywhere from like a realism standpoint. It's just something I personally like to do to help break up the space from time to time, or even give it some of that lettuce texture feel to it. So it's just like a wave. Because then you can imagine all the different bugs and different mushrooms or whatever that could live and possibly grow and breed from this part of the tree, because it's so dense in the different foliage that it has. And I hope you guys are excited for a Cypress tutorial because I'm telling you, it's a good one. And I've been talking to him a lot, uh, not so much recently, but definitely a month ago where I joined his nightly stream with his friends, and they're just a great group of guys. And it just shows that, like, even, people that I would consider very professional, or even a lot of the people I look up to on even DeviantArt, like they're still people and they have their struggles and they definitely just want that art community that they can keep in touch with. Because I'm sure many of you feel like you can't relate to a lot of the people you're around, and you definitely want those friends that understand what you're doing and what you're trying to do. So I definitely would say try to your best to find that community, and I hope Concept Cookie gives you um, that a sense of that. Alright, so you can kind of see what I'm doing here. Now if I turn those layers on and off, you can definitely see a difference of where this feels more. Actually, let me zoom in for you guys. So this is definitely photo collage, and this is definitely more painted over. So you can see the difference. And I would probably take it to another detail level where it's still pretty sketchy and too blurry or out of focus for my taste. Where I really like to make things look crisp and have the angles be sharp.
Somebody asked if you can make a character in the picture.
Make a character in the picture
Yeah.
with my last 5 minutes? Probably not. If I were to add a character, I would probably block them in first. And usually if I'm going for more of a character piece, I'll think of the composition as a whole before I start. Where this one, it was just purely like environment based. But let's say I wanted to add a character. Let me think.
It's kind of less of a scene and more of just
Yeah, this would be a weird focus one. I'd probably do an extreme angling where I would have the character leaning up against the tree on the side. Maybe like you only see a part of them. Where this really the focus is on the environment as a whole, or maybe even sitting down here, or even here.
or maybe even like a fairy or something.
Oh, I guess I could do a fairy integration.
I feel like you're so like zoomed in on the tree, it's kind of hard to fit
Yeah.
full body without making like composition like all weird.
Yeah, I think for this one, I would actually just keep it more of an environment focus. Where you don't always need a character to give the light or the scene life. Sometimes even like if you add, I mean this would be more of a generic version, like if I added a bug on this leaf in the foreground, or if there was like a fox or something right here. Like there's different things you can do to add more interest to the scene and give it actual life than just having to add a character.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I totally would agree that usually I would add a character to the scene, but I think this one doesn't really call or feel necessary for a character.
Another question is, do you ever use 3D software for like concept work?
I used to. I will say, actually, I graduated at an art school with a 3D background. So actually, my background is not in digital painting so much as it is in 3D art. So I used to model a character, and I used to think the way I was going to even do my entire storybook was I was going to model all the characters, and I would just pose them differently and just paint over the actual models. But I feel like I've lost a lot of that skill on to do it quickly and efficiently, and it's not really as much fun as painting is. So I think it's a great tool, and I think that if it's something you find you can use very well, I definitely say integrate the two and use both to the best of your ability. Actually, this is a good example of where a lot of the photo is left over, and you can quickly just edit that just by painting over it, but still thinking about, okay, well the trunk of the tree or whatever this, maybe this is actual a branch, but I'm still going to give it some of those distinctions of it being a branch and covering the photo.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, I'm just having a lot of visual leftovers that I'm not
You,
looking to
yeah,
add.
you already like picked out the shapes that you want, so like anything else.
Oh, that was a good thing. That you want to pick out the different shapes from the photo. I guess I should have said that earlier. Because like you can definitely see the different shapes in the reference that was used, but then make it your own, and then that way, that's why using a photo can be so helpful. Especially with something as random and or organic as something like this.
I would even like compare it to like looking at shapes in like the clouds, where
Yeah,
like you can see like a character in there and like a creature, but like there isn't anything there. It's just like what you can imagine.
that's actually a
And
great comparison.
so, especially with something completely random like leaves, and like you picked out the shapes of a tree, even though there like wasn't really one there before.
hmm
So.
Actually, I almost want to like crop. Well, so I guess, I mean, if you guys kind of understand where this is going, I would just continue this process over and over. Because as the stream is coming to an hour, I'm going to actually cut this one short just by 2 minutes. And I hope you guys picked up some tips and tricks for you guys to learn in your own pieces. And as always, we do these every Wednesday at 2 p.m. and that's Central Time, and that's -6 or -5 GMT if you're outside of the States. And the topic is usually posted to our Facebook, Twitter, and DeviantArt page about an hour, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on when I get the marketing done for it. And yeah, as always, I hope you guys will join us next week, and hopefully you might have some more questions you want to ask. And always feel open to asking, even if you're not sure if it relates to the topic or if you feel like I might have already answered it in the previous live stream. Ask it again, because if you don't know it, I would rather have you walk away from the live stream knowing something you didn't when you didn't before the live stream started. So thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully we'll see you next week. And also look forward to Psychro's tutorial tomorrow. And that's all the news. So thank you guys again, and we're out. Bye guys.